The year is 1962. The place is Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary, the most secure prison in America, home to the country's most dangerous criminals. Al Capone called it hell on earth. Machine Gun Kelly said it was the end of the world. But on the night of June 11th, 3 men would prove that even hell has an exit. This is the story of the greatest prison break in American history. This is the story of how they vanished into the night, leaving behind only questions that haunt us to this day. A story the FBI spent decades trying to bury. A story that challenges everything we thought we knew about the impossible. By the time you finish watching this, you'll know secrets that took investigators 60 years to uncover. You'll see evidence that was hidden from the public, and you'll understand why this case remains one of the most controversial mysteries in criminal history. 3 men. One night, in a plan so audacious, so meticulously crafted, that it would expose the greatest security failure in federal prison history. This is the story of Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers. But reputation and reality are 2 different things. Robert Stroud, the infamous Birdman of Alcatraz, spent 17 years in solitary confinement. Guards walked the corridors every 30 minutes, day and night. Surprise inspections could happen at any moment. The dining hall was monitored by guards with rifles. The recreation yard was surrounded by gun towers. For 29 years, Alcatraz held the reputation of being escape-proof. These men had tried to break out of other prisons. They could hear the sounds of the city, cars, boats, people living their lives just over a mile away. The inmates could see San Francisco from their cells. Freedom was visible but unreachable. It was a form of torture designed to break the spirit. They had bribed guards, tunneled through walls, even started riots. But Alcatraz was different. To understand how impossible this escape was, you need to understand Alcatraz itself. Picture an island, 1.25 miles off the coast of San Francisco, surrounded by some of the most treacherous waters in the world. The currents here don't just flow, they rage. Cold enough to kill a man in 20 minutes. They've been known to pull full-grown men under in seconds. The water temperature hovers between 50 and 60 degrees Fahrenheit, year-round. But the water was just the first line of defense. Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary opened in 1934, built on the bones of a military fortress. The walls were reinforced concrete, 3 feet thick in some places. Men who had proven themselves too dangerous, too clever, too escape-prone for any other facility in America. But these weren't ordinary criminals. These were the worst of the worst. The cell blocks were constructed like bank vaults. Every door was steel. Every window was barred. Every corridor was monitored. The prison housed a maximum of 336 inmates at any given time. Al Capone spent 4.5 years here. Machine Gun Kelly died within these walls. The security protocols were military precise. Every inmate was counted 5 times a day. But perhaps the most ingenious security measure was psychological. And it worked. Frank Morris was a natural leader, but he was also careful. He spent months evaluating potential partners, watching how other inmates behaved under pressure, identifying who could be trusted and who couldn't. The Anglin brothers were the obvious choice. They had the criminal experience, the physical capability, and most importantly, they had each other. Brothers who had spent their entire lives together would never betray each other for a reduced sentence or special privileges. He approached Alan West, a car thief from New York who occupied the cell next to his. They spoke in code, using prison slang and references that would mean nothing to eavesdropping guards. They called their plan going fishing, a reference to the waters they would need to cross. West was street smart, mechanically inclined, and had connections on the outside. Maurice began what he called intelligence gathering. He cleaned administrative offices and studied architectural drawings left on desks. He worked in the electrical shop and learned about the building's wiring and ventilation systems. He was enthusiastic about the escape, but lacked the discipline and patience required for long-term planning. He was also the most likely to panic under pressure. Maurice began to have doubts about including him, but by then, West already knew too much about the plan. He even volunteered to help with maintenance work, giving him access to areas most inmates never saw. Guards walked the corridors every 30 minutes, shining flashlights into cells. Any unusual sound could trigger an investigation. The men had to work in complete silence, in absolute darkness, with the constant threat of discovery hanging over them. Larger pieces were flushed down toilets or hidden in trash during work details. As they dug deeper into the walls, they created fake wall panels to cover their work. These panels were made from cardboard, painted to match the original wall color, and held in place with a mixture of soap and toilet paper. Nothing could be left in the cells where it might be discovered during inspections, but Morris wanted a 4th man, someone who could provide additional skills or resources. Clarence worked in the kitchen, where he could observe the guards' meal schedules and movement patterns. During the day, when cells were inspected, the panels looked like part of the original construction. What he found was both encouraging and terrifying. Both men were skilled at picking locks, a talent they had developed during their bank robbing days. He discovered that the corridor connected to a vertical shaft that led to the roof. The shaft was used for ventilation and was equipped with a ladder, but the ladder was old, rusty, and might not support a man's weight. The corridor was used for plumbing and electrical work, and it was completely unguarded, but it was also a dead end. There was no obvious way to reach the outside, but they still faced a greater challenge of getting off the island alive. Prison workshops provided some opportunities. Maurice worked in the electrical shop. John Anglin was assigned to the laundry. Clarence worked in the kitchen. The work was agonizingly slow. The deteriorated concrete had to be removed, grain by grain, to avoid making noise. Each piece of debris had to be carefully collected and disposed of. But they also faced a new challenge. The holes were getting large enough to crawl through, but they still didn't know what was on the other side. Metal fragments were collected from the machine shop. One by one, these innocent items were smuggled back to the cells and hidden in carefully prepared caches. After that, the inmates were left alone until 6 a.m. That gave the conspirators 8 hours of darkness to work. But they also had something more dangerous: the knowledge that they were committed to a plan that would either make them free men or dead men. Each man began to accumulate small tools and materials. The 4 men began to meet during work details in the prison library and in the recreation yard. It sounded simple. In reality, it would require months of preparation, incredible attention to detail, and perfect execution. Morris laid out the basic concept. They would dig through the walls of their cells, access the utility corridor behind the cell block, climb to the roof, and escape by water. The first challenge was tools. They needed something to scrape away the deteriorating concrete. Spoons disappeared from the dining hall. Nail clippers were taken from the barbershop. Pieces of wire were salvaged from repair work. But the most crucial element was information. The men needed to understand the prison's construction, its security protocols, and its weaknesses. He volunteered for every work detail that would give him access to different parts of the prison. The Anglin brothers contributed their own intelligence. John worked in the laundry, which gave him access to prison uniforms and cleaning supplies. Alan West proved to be the weak link. By the spring of 1962, the 4 men had everything they needed to begin the physical work of escaping. There was no middle ground. Every night, at 9:30 p.m., the lights went out in cell block B. The final guard check occurred at 10 p.m. But 8 hours wasn't really 8 hours. Maurice began with his cell, B138. Using a stolen spoon, he began scraping away at the wall behind his bunk. The disposal method was ingenious. During the day, the men would scatter the concrete dust in the prison yard, mixing it with dirt and gravel. But the most brilliant aspect of their plan was the concealment method. The fake walls were so convincing that guards would shine their flashlights directly on them during nightly checks and see nothing suspicious. John Anglin worked on cell B150. His digging revealed that the wall was even more deteriorated than Maurice had hoped. In some places, the concrete was so soft that it could be scooped out with bare hands. But this also created new problems. The hole was growing faster than expected, and it was becoming harder to conceal. Clarence Anglin faced the biggest challenge. His cell, B152, had a wall that was partially reinforced with steel mesh. The mesh had been installed years earlier during renovation work, and it couldn't be cut with their improvised tools. Clarence had to work around the mesh, creating a smaller hole that would be harder to squeeze through. Alan West's cell, B156, presented a different problem. The wall was more solid than the others, requiring more time and effort to penetrate. West also proved to be the least skilled at concealing his work. His fake wall panels were crude, and he often left concrete debris in his cell. By February 1962, all 4 men had made significant progress. Maurice was the first to break through. On a cold February night, he pushed his fake wall panel aside and squeezed through the hole he had been digging for months. Behind the cells was a utility corridor, about 3 feet wide and running the length of the cell block. Maurice spent several nights exploring the corridor, moving by touch in absolute darkness. They had solved the first part of the puzzle. Getting out of their cells, spring 1962. The 4 conspirators had been working for almost a year, and their escape plan was entering its final phase. But with success so close, the risks were multiplying. The fake wall panels were becoming harder to maintain. The constant removal and replacement was causing them to deteriorate. More concerning, other inmates were beginning to notice unusual behavior. The holes in their cell walls were now large enough for a man to crawl through. The escape would happen in June, during the new moon, when the night would be darkest. Maurice made a crucial decision. They would need to accelerate their timeline. But first, they needed to solve the problem of getting off the island. They cut the raincoats into panels and used a mixture of soap and rubber cement to seal the seams. The process was painstaking. Each seam had to be perfectly waterproof, or the raft would sink in the bay. Using soap, toilet paper, and real human hair collected from the prison barbershop, they created realistic-looking heads that could be placed in their beds. But the barber, who was also an inmate, was sympathetic to escape attempts. The final step was painting the heads with a mixture of shoe polish and paint stolen from the prison workshop. He began saving hair in small quantities, which was then smuggled back to the cells. The heads were crude by today's standards, but in the dim light of the prison corridors, they were convincing enough to fool a guard making a quick check. These raincoats were made of rubberized fabric that could be washed. John Anglin, who worked in the laundry, began stealing raincoats one at a time. They also constructed paddles from wood stolen from the prison workshop and life jackets from additional rain. The holes were complete, the raft was constructed, the dummy heads were finished, and the escape route had been tested. He couldn't fit through it. He saw what appeared to be sleeping inmates in cells B1, B2 150, and B152. He had no way of knowing that he was looking at soap and toilet paper sculptures. More troubling, he was beginning to show signs of panic. The concrete scraped against his prison uniform as he pushed himself through the narrow opening. On the other side, he found himself in the utility corridor he had explored so many times before. Maurice climbed first, testing each rung carefully. The ladder held. If he was left behind, he might inform the guards to save himself. But if he was included, his panic might doom them all. The grate was held in place by rivets that had been loosened over weeks of careful work. Maurice pushed the grate aside, and for the first time in years, he breathed free air. Each man carried a portion of the disassembled raft and other escape equipment, but it was their only option. Maurice went first, followed by John, then Clarence. Each man carried his portion of the escape equipment, but it was also unguarded. The prison administration had never imagined that inmates could reach the roof. The sound of waves crashing against the rocks was deafening. The water was black and cold, and the current was already pulling at their feet. They moved through the corridor in complete darkness, navigating by memory and touch. Now they had to trust their lives to a raft made of stolen raincoats and their ability to navigate one of the most dangerous bodies of water in America. The raft held its shape, but in the darkness, it was impossible to tell if it was completely waterproof. They would only know for certain when they were in the water. He talked about the escape more openly, took unnecessary risks, and seemed to be losing his nerve. They could abort the escape and try again later, or they could leave Wes behind and hope that his loyalty would keep him silent. The current immediately grabbed them, pulling them away from Alcatraz and toward the open ocean. This room housed ventilation equipment and was accessed by maintenance workers during the day, but at night, it was completely deserted. But the plan still faced one final obstacle: Alan West. Swimming was not an option. The water was too cold, the currents too strong, and the distance too great. They would need a boat. Their destination was the north side of the prison, where they had identified a drainage pipe that led to the shoreline. The solution came from an unexpected source. The prison laundry used large quantities of raincoats for the guards and work details. They needed something to delay that discovery as long as possible. Using a technique they had learned from other inmates, the men began constructing a life raft. The fully assembled raft was too large to conceal in their cells. They would have to transport it in pieces and assemble it on the night of the escape. The finished raft was approximately 6 feet by 14 feet, large enough to carry 4 men, but the raft created a new problem: where to hide it? The second major challenge was creating a diversion. The nightly guard checks meant that their absence would be discovered within hours of the escape. The solution was the famous dummy heads. The hair was the most difficult component to acquire. The prison barbershop was heavily monitored, and hair was supposed to be swept up and disposed of immediately. Each dummy head took weeks to construct. The soap base had to be carved into a realistic shape, then covered with layers of toilet paper and hair. By May 1962, everything was ready. West had fallen behind in his digging. His hole was smaller than the others, and he was having trouble enlarging it without making noise. Morris faced a dilemma. West knew every detail of the plan. The decision was made for them. On the night of June 11, 1962, when the time came to execute their plan, Alan West's hole was still too small. The 3 remaining conspirators faced a choice that would haunt them for the rest of their lives, however long those lives might be. They chose to run. June 11, 1962, 9:30 p.m. The lights went out in cell block B for the last time that Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers would ever see. The final guard check occurred at 10 p.m. Guard Lawrence Bartlett walked the corridor, shining his flashlight into each cell. At 10:30 p.m., the 3 men began their escape. Morris went first. He moved his fake wall panel aside and squeezed through the hole he had been digging for over a year. John Anglin followed, then Clarence. The journey to the ventilation shaft took 15 minutes. The shaft was a vertical climb of approximately 30 feet, using a ladder that was old and partially rusted. At the top of the shaft, they found themselves in a small room just below the prison roof. The final barrier was a ventilation grate that led to the roof. The roof of Alcatraz was a dangerous place. It was unlit, covered with obstacles, and surrounded by a 30-foot drop to the ground. The 3 men moved carefully across the roof, staying low to avoid being silhouetted against the sky. The climb down was treacherous. The drainage pipe was old, corroded, and not designed to support a man's weight. At the bottom of the pipe, they found themselves on the rocky shoreline of Alcatraz Island. This was the moment of truth. For over a year, They had planned and prepared for this moment. They assembled the raft quickly, inflating it with air from their lungs. At approximately 11:30 p.m., Frank Morris and John and Clarence Anglin pushed their makeshift raft into San Francisco Bay and began paddling toward the mainland. Behind them, the prison slept peacefully. The guards continued their rounds, unaware that 3 of America's most wanted criminals had just vanished into the night. They would not be discovered missing for another 7.5 hours. June 12, 1962. 7 a.m., Guard Lawrence Bartlett began his morning rounds in cell block B. He had been working at Alcatraz for 3 years and had never experienced a major incident. That was about to change. Nothing unusual, but something felt wrong. The figure was too perfectly positioned, cell B-138. Frank Morris. Bartlett shined his flashlight into the cell and saw a figure lying in the bunk, facing the wall. Instead of Frank Morris, he was looking at a crude dummy made of soap and toilet paper, topped with real human hair. Morris, time to get up. No response. Another dummy. Bartlett opened the cell door and approached the bunk. What he saw would haunt him for the rest of his life. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He ran to the next cell. Cell B-150. John Anglin. Cell B-152. Clarence Anglin. Another dummy. The first official count confirmed what everyone feared. 3 inmates were missing. Bartlett's hands were shaking as he reached for his radio. "We have a problem in cell block B. We have a major problem." West had also been digging through his wall, and he had been in on the escape plan. He described how the men had dug through the walls, how they had constructed the raft, and how they had planned to reach the mainland. But his hole was too small, and he had been left behind. The Coast Guard deployed ships and helicopters to search. San Francisco Bay. Police departments across the country were notified. The media turned the story into front-page news. This had not been a spontaneous escape attempt. It had been a carefully planned operation that took over a year to execute. At each stage, investigators found evidence of careful planning and execution. The escape route had been tested and refined over months of preparation. A paddle and a life jacket. The FBI concluded that this proved the men had drowned, but the evidence raised more questions than it answered. FBI agents recreated the journey from the cells to the shoreline, timing each segment and identifying potential problems. The FBI received thousands of tips from across the country. The photograph had been taken in Brazil, and the men appeared to be working on a farm. Forensic analysis was inconclusive. The photograph was too blurry and taken from too great a distance to make a positive identification. During his interrogation, he made comments that suggested he knew his brothers were still alive, but when pressed for details, he claimed he was just trying to get attention. The men had been seen in Mexico, Canada, South America, and every state in the Union. They began intensive surveillance of the Anglin family in Georgia, hoping to detect contact with the escaped brothers. They would make cryptic comments about the boys in recorded conversations. Phone lines were tapped, mail was intercepted, and family members were followed. Each lead had to be investigated, and each investigation led nowhere. J. Edgar Hoover, who had personally ordered the intensive manhunt, died in 1972, and they were no closer to solving the mystery of what happened on that night in June 1962. His successors had different priorities and were less interested in pursuing a case that had already consumed enormous resources. They were part of a tight-knit clan that valued loyalty above all else. But privately, they were dealing with a situation that was both wonderful and terrifying. The family had a long history of conflicts with law enforcement, and they had learned to keep their secrets. The caller identified himself as John Anglin and said that he and Clarence were safe. They knew that any contact with the escaped brothers could result in federal charges for themselves. They also knew that the FBI was watching them, waiting for exactly this kind of contact. He couldn't provide details about their location, but he wanted the family to know they were alive. A photograph showing John and Clarence Anglin standing together, apparently on a farm in South America. The photograph was taken by Robert Anglin, another brother who had arranged to meet them. They concluded that the escape was physically possible, but barely. The family claimed that the boys referred to other relatives, that the trips were for legitimate business, and that the phone calls were from friends and distant relatives. Clarence, who had been the family jokester, lost his sense of humor. They were free, but they were also alone. He had been unable to seek proper medical treatment because of his fugitive status. He was buried in an unmarked grave, far from his family and homeland. Sometimes, packages would arrive with no return address, containing items that only John and Clarence would know to send. He decided to tell the truth. They could never form lasting relationships with people who might ask questions about their past. The death of his brother had broken something inside him. He became increasingly paranoid and isolated. They could never return to the United States, even for family funerals or weddings. The letter contained details about family members that only Clarence would know, but it provided no information about his location. The The paddle and life jacket found in the bay were examined for fingerprints, DNA, and other traces. They would arrange meetings in remote locations, sometimes traveling hundreds of miles to spend a few hours with the brothers. But it was also proof that the most daring prison escape in American history had been successful. The risk was enormous, but the bonds of family were stronger than the fear of arrest. The agency was convinced that the men had drowned, and much of their effort was focused on finding bodies rather than tracking living fugitives. According to family members, John and Clarence had made their way to South America, where they worked as farmers and laborers. They had learned to speak Spanish and Portuguese, adopted new identities, and integrated into local communities. They had followed over 1,200 leads, conducted interviews in every state, and coordinated with law enforcement agencies around the world. This may have caused them to overlook important clues. Witnesses described to men who matched their description, working together with the same techniques the brothers had used before their imprisonment. But the robbers were never caught, and the connection could not be proven. The results were inconclusive. The items had been in salt water for days, destroying most potential evidence. Behind each bunk, they found a hole large enough for a man to crawl through. But the intensive investigation didn't begin until 1963. By then, the trail was cold. The men had a full year to establish new identities, settle in new locations, and cover their tracks. The holes had been covered by fake wall panels that were so convincing that guards had walked past them for months without noticing. Special Agent John Hennessy assembled a team of investigators, forensic experts, and analysts to solve the mystery of what happened to Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers. Within minutes, the prison was in chaos. Alarms were sounding, guards were running through the corridors, and the warden was being awakened at his home on the island. But the real shock came when investigators examined the cells. This was not just a prison escape. It was a federal crime that would require a massive investigation. Special Agent John Hennessy was assigned to lead the case. A plastic bag containing personal items belonging to the Anglin brothers, including photographs and letters. The bag had been carefully sealed to keep the contents dry. This evidence seemed to contradict the theory that the men had drowned. Why would drowning men take the time to waterproof their personal belongings? His first task was to determine how the men had escaped and where they might have gone. The FBI was notified immediately. The trail led from the cells to the utility corridor, up the ventilation shaft, across the roof, and down to the shoreline. But the most disturbing discovery was in Alan West's cell. West was immediately taken into custody and interrogated. Over the next several days, he provided investigators with a detailed account of the escape plan. But West's information also revealed the true scope of the conspiracy. The FBI launched one of the largest manhunts in American history, but the searchers found no trace of the three men. It was as if they had simply vanished into the night. 2 days after the escape, the first piece of evidence was discovered floating in San Francisco Bay. The FBI's investigation into the Alcatraz escape would become one of the longest-running cases in the agency's history. The first phase of the investigation focused on the physical evidence, but the FBI also found something else. The second phase of the investigation focused on the escape route. The third phase was the most extensive, tracking down leads, but some leads were more credible than others. In 1963, a photograph was sent to the FBI showing three men who resembled the escape. In 1965, a bank robbery in Atlanta was attributed to the Anglin brothers. The most significant development came in 1967. Robert Anglin, another brother of John and Clarence, was arrested for drug trafficking. The FBI's investigation was hampered by several factors. The escape had occurred in 1962. The investigation was also complicated by the FBI's own assumptions. The agency was convinced that the men had drowned, and much of their effort was focused on finding bodies rather than tracking living fugitives. This may have caused them to overlook important clues. In 1970, the FBI shifted its focus to the families. They would make cryptic comments about the boys in recorded conversations. They began intensive surveillance of the Anglin family in Georgia, hoping to detect contact with the escaped brothers. Phone lines were tapped, mail was intercepted, and family members were followed. J. Edgar Hoover, who had personally ordered the intensive died. They had followed over 1,200 leads, conducted interviews in every state, and coordinated with law enforcement agencies around the world. In 1972, his successors had different priorities and were less interested in pursuing a case that had already consumed enormous resources. The family claimed that the boys referred to other relatives, that the trips were for legitimate business, and that the phone calls were from friends and distant relatives. But privately, they were dealing with a situation that was both wonderful and terrifying. The surveillance revealed interesting patterns. Family members would sometimes take unexplained trips to other states. They would receive phone calls from unknown numbers. The caller identified himself as John Anglin and said that he and Clarence were safe. He couldn't provide details about their location, but he wanted the family to know they were alive, and they were no closer to solving the mystery of what happened on that night in June 1962. They also knew that the FBI was watching them, waiting for exactly this kind of contact. but the FBI could never prove that these activities were connected to the escaped prisoners. Sometimes, packages would arrive with no return address, containing items that only John and Clarence would know to send. The investigation was also complicated by the changing nature of the FBI itself. They could never form lasting relationships with people who might ask questions about their past. They could never return to the United States, even for family funerals or weddings. The family knew that releasing it would bring renewed FBI attention and might endanger John and Clarence. The death of his brother had broken something inside him. He became increasingly paranoid and isolated. John Anglin, who had always been the more outgoing of the brothers, became withdrawn and suspicious. He had been unable to seek proper medical treatment because of his fugitive status. He was buried in an unmarked grave, far from his family and homeland. The letter contained details about family members that only Clarence would know, but it provided no information about his location. They had been supported by a network of family members and friends who helped them establish new identities and find work. John Anglin had died of cancer in the 1980s, unable to seek proper medical treatment because of his fugitive status. Clarence had lived into the 2000s, but had become increasingly isolated and paranoid. If Robert was telling the truth, why had he waited so long to reveal it? If the brothers had successfully established new lives in South America, why had they never attempted to clear their names or negotiate a surrender? On his deathbed, he made a decision that would change the public perception of the Alcatraz escape forever. He decided to tell the truth. According to his account, Morris had drowned during the crossing to the mainland. His body had been swept out to sea and never recovered. Clarence, who had been the family jokester, lost his sense of humor. They were free, but they were also alone. The History Channel documentary was watched by millions of viewers. Books were written, podcasts were produced, and internet forums where he had lied to federal investigators, risked imprisonment, and lived with the constant fear that his brothers would be recaptured. Using facial recognition technology, they compared the faces in the photograph to known images of John and Clarence Anglin. The results were striking. The facial features matched with a high degree of probability. But in 2015, as he lay dying in a Georgia hospital, he decided that the truth needed to be told. The entire confession could be an elaborate hoax, designed to generate publicity. But it was also proof that the most daring prison escape in American history had been successful. But they also stated that the case would remain open until the fugitives were found, dead or alive. No one else had come forward to confirm that they had seen or helped the brothers. Others believed that it was just another false lead in a case that had generated hundreds of false leads over the decades. No documentary evidence had been found to support the claim that they had lived in South America. A photograph showing John and Clarence Anglin standing together, apparently on a farm in South America. The photograph was taken by Robert Anglin, another brother who had arranged to meet them. They would arrange meetings in remote locations, sometimes traveling hundreds of miles to spend a few hours with the brothers. The risk was enormous, but the bonds of family were stronger than the fear of arrest. By 1975, the FBI had spent over $3 million on the investigation, equivalent to about $15 million today. Robert Anglin provided details that had never been revealed publicly, including the photograph of his brothers taken in Brazil in 1975. According to family members, John and Clarence had made their way to South America, where they worked as farmers and laborers. They had learned to speak Spanish and Portuguese, adopted new identities, and integrated into local communities. They were part of a tight-knit clan that valued loyalty above all else. The family had a long history of conflicts with law enforcement, and they had learned to keep their secrets. But they had not found Frank Morris or the Anglin brothers. While the FBI was following cold leads and chasing shadows, the Anglin family was hiding secrets that would not be revealed for decades. The Anglin brothers grew up in a large family in rural Georgia. After the escape, the family closed ranks. They refused to cooperate with the FBI investigation, claiming they had no knowledge of the brothers' whereabouts. John and Clarence Anglin had survived the escape. The first contact came in 1963, almost a year after the escape. A phone call to the family home in Georgia. The family was overjoyed but also terrified. They knew that any contact with the escaped brothers could result in federal charges for themselves. Over the next several years, the contact became more regular. Phone calls on birthdays and holidays, letters sent through intermediaries. The family developed an elaborate system of code words and secret signals. In 1975, the family received the most concrete proof yet that the brothers were alive. The photograph was kept secret for 40 years. The brothers had not only survived the escape, they had built new lives for themselves. But the life of a fugitive was not easy. They could never stay in one place for long. The psychological toll was enormous. In 1987, the family received devastating news. John Anglin had died of cancer while living in Brazil. Clarence continued to live in South America, but his contacts with the family became less frequent. The last confirmed contact with Clarence Anglin came in 1993, when he sent a letter to the family saying that he was in poor health and didn't expect to live much longer. In 2015, Robert Anglin was dying of cancer. Robert Englund had carried his brother's secret for over 50 years. The confession was given to the History Channel, which was producing a documentary about the Alcatraz escape. According to Robert, John and Clarence had not only survived the escape, they had lived in South America for decades. But Robert's confession contained disturbing details about the price of freedom. Robert also revealed that Frank Maurice had not survived the escape. The confession was explosive, but it also raised new questions. The History Channel brought in forensic experts to analyze the 1975 photograph, but the FBI was skeptical. They pointed out that Robert Englund was a convicted criminal with a history of lying to federal investigators. The photograph could have been doctored or staged. The FBI also noted that there was no independent verification of Robert's claims. The U.S. Marshals Service, which had taken over the case from the FBI, announced that they would investigate the new claims. The confession divided experts and amateur investigators. Some believed that Robert Englund had finally revealed the truth about one of America's greatest mysteries, but the confession had one undeniable impact. It renewed public interest in the case. If you found this story as fascinating, make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you don't miss any of these incredible stories. Thanks for watching, and remember, sometimes the most impossible stories are the ones that turn out to be true. I'll see you in the next video.